Should I change my LS50s for this beauty? Let's see. Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Now what we are having here today is a big stand mounter KEF R3. This one costs around $2,000 and it's the smallest one from R series. But make no mistake, this is not a small monitor speaker that are usually two-way. No, this is actually quite an interesting beast. Profile, it's not that big. It's actually quite slim. But its tall stands at 42 centimeters. It's reasonably deep, that's not the problem either. But the interesting thing about this model is that it's actually a three-way design. Now, it's not two-way or two-way and a half as most of the stand mounters on the market are. Actually, even some floor standards that you see multiple cones, but they're still 2.5 way design because of the crossover and things like that. But R3 here is a true three-way speaker. And how is that? For those of you who are not that familiar with KEF's UniQ driver, I'll just tell you that this upper cone is actually an UniQ driver, so-called. That means dual concentric driver. Basically, in the middle of it, there is a tweeter. It's a small aluminum tweeter. And then this bigger cone around it is a dedicated mid-range cone. And then, of course, we have a base cone. All of that is backed up by a three-way crossover from the back. So each of these cones have a dedicated range of frequencies to cover, which makes this a truly three-way design, even though it's still a pretty compact stand mounter speaker. And I won't bother you much with specs, because if you follow my channel, you know that the biggest chunk of every review is actually sound quality and comparisons. But I find that there are few things that you should know about. First of all, this is bass reflex speaker, and the bass reflex port is located on the back. And in my experience, R3 likes to be a little bit further away from the walls. In my room, I got best results keeping it some like 60 or 70 centimeters away from the wall. That way, I achieved best soundstage depth and the tidier, most controlled bassline. Of course, if you need to, you can move them closer to walls, especially if you like that extra bass emphasis, or you can even use provided port plugs to help with too much of the bass if you need to keep them close to the walls. But as I mentioned, the best positioning for them is a little bit out in the free space, at least in my experience. Down here you can see B-wiring binding posts. Now these are jumpers that I'm using currently. Actually, I took them together with the speakers from my friend. This is like single crystal copper jumpers. You don't need those because inside there are jumpers provided, and you just need to turn these knobs here between the binding posts, and inside of the unit those jumpers will align and connect these. Currently they're disconnected because these inside jumpers are not of a really high quality. It's just a nickel-plated brass, and if you use any decent quality jumpers, like in the case of my friend, he's using single copper jumpers, you will achieve better results, more details from the high frequency spectrum, cleaner sound quality. So I suggest doing that if you already paid for these fine speakers. Now that out of the way, let's talk about just a few specs that you might find interesting and important. One of these is the actual sensitivity of the speaker. And it's rated at 87 dB, which is actually not insensitive, but not too sensitive either. It falls just somewhere right in the middle, in my opinion and in my experience. meaning that these will appreciate a stronger amp with more grunt, with more power, because that way you will get firmer grip, especially on the bass notes, but it doesn't really need one to sing pretty good. So, for example, I paired it with my Hegel H90. It works just fine. Control and detailing and everything is just fine. But I have heard it with a more powerful amps, and I did notice that increased grip over sound, and as I said, especially over that bass and mid-bass section. And just before we move to talks about sound quality, I just wanted to mention that there is a speaker grill provided in the box, and I actually really liked these grills because they look stylish, in my opinion at least. They're completely flat, there are no holes on the speaker itself, as you can see. This is a magnetic one. And this is one of the rare grills that I actually find aesthetically appealing. But if you're after the best possible transparency, you should probably listen to them without it. Now, all that said, it's time to move to their sound signature and sound fidelity overall. That said, I find these speakers to be really nicely balanced ones. Nothing grabs your attention in negative way. For example, starting with tonality, everything sounds pretty even. Now, bass is quick, it's precise, but it's punchy. It has more grunt than you would expect from a smaller bookshelf speaker, stand mounter actually. And that's because there is this like dedicated bass driver that doesn't need to do mid-range frequencies. So R3 actually packs quite a bit of punch into the bass line. As I said, fortunately, bass is on the quicker side. It's quite nimble, it's quite well controlled. That said, it's not dry either. It's actually, if anything, on a slightly warmer side. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like some warm and fuzzy bass, it's just a quick, nimble bass with a touch of warmth to make everything sound a little bit juicier and give some grunt and oomph to the sound. And I think most people actually prefer this kind of tuning that's mostly neutral, really precise, but with just a touch of warmth and boldening of the bass line. Moving to the mid-range, it's present, it's upfront, but it's clean and very crisp. There are no nasties to be heard of. For example, I never heard any sort of sibilance. Vocals sound present, they sound realistic, they are positioned in the center securely. There's also quite a bit of fullness to the vocals and all of the instruments, and that's of course helped by that slightly bold bass and the mid-bass. So at all times I feel that the mid-range is present, it's upfront, it's really resolving, but not in a grabby, clawy kind of way. To my ears, it's actually a pretty good mix of being bold and being positively edgy and present and analytical, again in a positive way. Because layering of the instruments, like separation between tones, is really good. This is a clean sounding speaker. And that leads me to the highest frequency spectrum. Well, oddly enough, I found it to be a little bit sweet. Again, it's very clean, it's crisp and precise, but to my ears, it is a little bit on the sweeter side. Because, as I mentioned, we have very prominent mid-range, and that also goes for that upper mid-range that gives presence to instruments and vocals and everything. But when we move to even higher regions, those that give a lot of air and that infuse texture, like the sense of texture into the notes, I could say that R3 is not that open sounding. It's actually a little bit tamer in those highest of the frequencies, and that makes it sound a little bit sweet. So I'm talking about really, really high frequencies. So how that sounds in reality is that, for example, if we have some sort of string instrument, like a guitar, and there is like a sudden pluck of a string, you will hear it very cleanly, with great energy, with really crisp edges and transients. But if we are listening to something as saxophone, again, it will sound clear and crisp, but you will not hear that last bit of air, like that air blowing through the instrument, because this is not a particularly airy sounding speaker. So all in all, I feel that R3 is a really well-rounded product tonally, being fast, precise, clean and crisp, but just slightly warm in the bass and mid-bass section, and just slightly sweeter in the highest register, which actually makes it a very, very listenable speaker. And from my experience, most people, if offered something brighter and more resolving, airier, but also a little bit more analytical, or something like this that is really clean, tidy and controlled, but a little bit sweeter up top, I think most people would choose tuning like this one. And they already know R3 is a really popular product, and I think that is the part of why that is. But the story doesn't really end here, because it has other qualities that I need to mention. First of all, for relatively small speaker, it has pretty good energy. It has pretty good dynamics. So if I listen to something with like big dynamic range, for example, some sort of classical music, I definitely hear that it moves from really silent parts of the recording to loud part of the recordings with more ease. It just do that more effortlessly than most stand mounters that I've heard, especially compared to those smaller two-way designs. It just has more juice and it's ready to go, to snap easily. It's just more ready to release energy and dynamics into your listening room. Now, when it comes to the soundstage, I'm again quite pleased with it. It's not particularly wide, but it's nicely organized. It's nicely layered. And it's quite deep too. So I feel that I hear a lot of echoes and I hear a lot of depth from the recording, but it doesn't spread really wide and it doesn't go really tall compared to some other speakers. I think that is mainly because of that slightly sweeter up top. That's a thing with R3. Because a lot of that sense of space and air around the soundstage and around the instruments comes from those highest frequencies. Here, that's quite decent, but it's not like class leading or anything. But what you do get is highly focused soundstage, center is firmly in its place, every instrument is actually firmly in its place, and it has that sort of presence. It feels forward, it feels close to you, and there's quite decent, like physical feeling to notes and to singers, and I quite liked that. Now, to put these things into perspective, I'll compare it to my own KEF LS50. I guess everybody already knows about that speaker, and it's a smaller two-way design. I've been living with it for quite some time now, and what happened is that actually my friend has been living with R3 for quite some time now. And what we did is we exchanged our speakers. I sent my LS50s at his place, he brought R3s to my place, and I think that's a pretty interesting experience for both of us, because we immediately noticed some differences, starting with the fact that R3 has this sort of boldness and dynamics and grunt that LS50 simply cannot match. For example, listen to a classical song or any sort of song that has a lot of dynamic headroom. So not something new and compressed like pop or rock songs, most of them at least, but some sort of classical or really well recorded music. For example, I'll put some examples on the screen, and you'll hear that R3 can bring more dynamics, more excitement. It just much more naturally and effortlessly go from silent parts to really loud and dynamic parts, and it feels exciting. Listening that same song or songs on my LS50s, I hear all of the information when it comes to the resolution, but dynamics is compressed and bass does not have that same impact, and the sound just does not feel as physical, as visceral as with R3. And if I would to carefully choose songs that really appreciate that dynamics headroom, that effortlessness when it comes to punch and grunt and dynamic scale, I would easily conclude that R3 is better for these types of songs. Also, another genre that comes to mind is if you're listening to any sort of EDM. So if you're listening to a lot of electronic music with heavy electronically produced bass line that needs to go deep and to be felt physically, again, R3 will definitely do a better job of bringing that, of impressing you and exciting you that way. On the other hand, it's not a one-sided story here. LS50, to my ears, is a more resolute speaker. It's more controlled speaker. It also offers more air up top. And what that means in reality is that it's capable of revealing atmosphere and air from the recording better. It can also create slightly bigger soundstage with more air in it and place instruments and vocals with better separation, just pinpoint them inside of that soundstage. It does that almost holographically. Compared to that, R3 sounds a little bit more mellow and everything is just a touch more melted together. It cannot spread the soundstage as airy and as precisely recreated as LS50. Interesting thing here is that a lot of this boils down to a personal preference. So for example, my own preference definitely leans toward LS50 and its like pinpointing holographic soundstage capabilities, and also somewhat grippier, quicker, more nimble bassline. On the other side, R3 here is definitely a livelier sounding in terms it's more dynamic, it just infuse more life and more juice and more punch into the music. And I'm pretty sure that I can speak for my friend that he would not change his speakers for LS50s. He's used to that sound. He tuned his system according to these speakers with more precise, more analytical leaning source, cabling, streamer, And he actually managed to achieve a pretty revealing and pretty analytical, precise sound that has a lot of this type of grunt and dynamics because of this bigger speaker. On the other hand, what I did in my own system is that I tended to LS50's character a little bit more. So I went with slightly warmer source, slightly warmer cabling. I actually prioritized tone timbre because that's what LS50 needs. And I again achieved something pretty good, like exceptional holographic soundstage, that I'm not ready to give up because of increased dynamics and power and grunt. And I'm diverging here from the review a little bit, but it's going to be an interesting development in the future, I believe, because I know my friend, he always tries to improve his own system, and he will try to get even more resolution and more control and more soundstage from R3, and probably at some point even upgrade them to maybe more revealing speaker or something like that. And on the other hand, I'll try going different way with keeping my LS50s for all of their positive characteristics, but adding a little bit more weight, grunt and fullness to the sound with some really decent subwoofers. And then down the road, we'll compare our results and who actually did what. And I believe that that will also be a very interesting experience. And last but not least, I wanted shortly to mention another contender in this similar price range. It's not sold anymore, it's actually Dynaudio Focus 160. A friend of mine brought that speaker to my home, and at that moment we compared that speaker to LS50, and that was really another great speaker at this similar price point. It's smaller than R3, it's a two-way design, but it has more authority and more grunt in the bass especially than LS50. However, it also has this sort of airiness and openness of the sound stage that I really like with LS50s. If anything, it even had like higher, taller soundstage. Everything was a little bit more laid back in spatial terms than both of these KEFs. Both R3 and LS50, they like to project things a little bit forward, especially main leading instruments and leading vocals. They can create really deep soundstage, but these leading vocals and leading instruments are presented in a forward manner. On the other hand, Dynaudio Focus presented like a more laid back, kicked back soundstage. Everything went just a little bit behind the speakers, but that said, soundstage was still, from that point on, quite deep, really wide, and really tall, even as I said, wider and taller in my opinion than the one with LS50s. And I just wanted to mention that as the another example of a similarly sized speaker that has a different set of qualities that are somewhere in between, like some things that speaker does even better than LS50, like soundstage width and height, airiness, and just the sense of atmosphere is also great. The bass line was a little bit deeper and more authoritative than with LS50s, but not nearly as much dynamic and punchy as with R3. So all that said, I think it's time to move to conclusion, but just before that, actually, I wanted to mention pairing. This smart voicing, in my opinion, makes it quite an easy match for most amps and most sound signatures out there. If you want to get a little bit more air and a little bit more atmosphere, pair it with slightly brighter, slightly more revealing amp. I don't think that you would lack juice and energy because it has it in spades. If you want to emphasize on that slightly warmer and sweeter character, just pair it with a similarly voiced amp and you'll get a lot of that grunt and juiciness and fullness, and you'll probably mellow out a little bit of that crispiness and clarity from the mid-range. So I think it pairs really well with a really wide range of equipment. It's just that you need to know what you want from it. You need to know in which direction you want to steer this speaker. If you want it to be as revealing and as analytical as possible, just pair it with such gear. If you want it to be fuller sounding, more mellower sounding, pair it with that type of gear. Because the speaker itself is mostly neutral. Now forget about my in-depth dive into sound quality where I'm mentioning like this is slightly warmer, this is slightly sweeter. In the grand scheme of things, this is a pretty neutral sounding speaker. And the one that, in my opinion, doesn't require much effort and too much attention to sound really, really good. In that sense, I could probably much easier recommend it over LS50s. LS50s are kinda tricky speaker. They are hugely revealing, they have immense resolution, but they're more punishing. Definitely more punishing. Just pair them with a little bit thin sounding gear and they will sound very thin. I even found them more finicky when it comes to positioning. For example, toe in of R3 and like moving them a little bit further away or closer to each other do changes sound stage and tonality a little bit, but not as much as with LS50s. So I kinda get why most of the reviewers praise them. They're really good speakers, but I have to say they don't really tick my personal boxes. It's maybe because I'm used to this different, smaller, brighter speaker, but this review should not be about me and my preferences, because objectively this is one mighty good speaker and I think praises were well worth it. If you didn't know that, iiWi, in the name of the channel, stands for Is It Worth It? And for R3 I can definitely say yes, it's worth it. I think it's a really great speaker that will match nicely in wide range of systems, and you can nudge it a little bit left or right to your own taste, and I think a lot of audiophiles would be really, really happy with this speaker, and for a lot of you I think this one might even be an endgame. Now with that said, it's time to finish this review. I really hope you liked it. If you did, then click that button, subscribe, share it with your friends, and even consider becoming a patron maybe, because this kind of independent work, not bought reviews, costs some money and effort and time. So I appreciate that, and huge thanks to all the patrons already. See you next time. Bye.